Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, we listen in to a book talk given at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas. Author John Gans discusses his book on the National Security Council staff. In this talk, Gans focuses on the career and the accomplishments of a single NSC staffer who ultimately perished during his duties in Bosnia. He uses the story of Nelson Drew as a way to illustrate both the power and the process that exists within the NSC, and it's also illuminating to help us better understand how relatively junior staffers or obscure staffers who many in the public may not have heard of may assume greater prominence when an issue suddenly bubbles to the forefront of the national security arena. We've seen this phenomenon, for example, recently in debate and testimony over the U.S. relations with Ukraine. Let's listen in.
I'm going to start with a little story and work my way and introduce you to one of the public servants who works on the National Security Council, and then talk a little bit about what their service means, and then we can sort of take some questions. But thank you for coming. In July 1995, President Bill Clinton was upset. The war in Bosnia, which by then had killed hundreds of thousands of people and created over 1 million refugees, had also led to criticism of the president by the public, by his counterparts abroad, by members of Congress, including those in his own party, by parts of his own government, many of whom were resigning in protest, and even by himself. An aggravated Clinton used to vent to aides and looked everywhere for ideas. At one point, he turned to a young Navy sailor who was sent to his office to set up a secure telephone line, literally connecting the phone to the jack, and said, "Hey, what do you think we should do on Bosnia?" And the young sailor looked at the president and said, "I don't know, Mr. President." At that moment in July 1995, very few people in Washington and around the world had any ideas for how to stop the violence in the Balkans or sort of end the long-term tensions between the ethnic and nationalist groups that erupted at the end of the Cold War. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of those people who did. But before I do, I just want to thank Will and thank the Clements Center and everybody here at the LBJ School for having me down to talk about the NSC at a very interesting moment for the National Security Council and the rest of Washington. And so I have written a book that touches on the NSC from Harry Truman, who helped establish the National Security Council, all the way to Donald Trump, who has made some decisions that have changed dramatically how the National Security Council works. But I'm going to tell you about this story about one staffer, because right now there are several hundred of these staffers sitting at the old executive office building, which is the building right next to the White House. They're in the Situation Room. Some of them are in the Oval Office, probably with the president as we speak. They might be doing phone calls with him and a head of state, as we found out in the past few weeks. They might be helping him on China tariffs. They might be helping him answer one of Iran's provocative actions. They might help him figure out what he's going to write to the head of North Korea. That can give you great comfort, or that can give you great concern, right? What I set out to do 9 years ago was try to understand what NSC staffers do with their days and what those days mean for the United States. And in this book, I try to explain not just those in Washington or those on the staff, but people just like you. Because I contend in the book, and I will contend today, that the National Security Council staff are not just the White House's warriors, they're all of yours. So I'm going to introduce you to one. His name is Samuel Nelson Drew. Now, I'll ask this question, but I think I know the answer to it. How many of you know who Samuel Nelson Drew is? Okay, Will Imbeden is a ringer. Anybody else? No. Right. I'm not surprised, but I thought I would ask. So let me tell you why you don't know who it is. The first thing is his three pretty plain names make him a hard man to Google. Put Samuel Nelson Drew in, and you got a lot of Samuels. You get a few Samuel Nelsons. You get a few Nelson Drews. But you don't get a lot of clarity. Right? And even when you do make it to the right page, much of the history that Nelson Drew ended up making is still hidden under wraps in archives or in the footnotes of books about more famous people. Now, he's one of many White House warriors who served on the powerful, elusive National Security Council staff since it was created in 1947. Now, Nelson Drew was born just a few months later, after the National Security Act of 1947 was passed. His father was an Army officer in Wurzburg, Germany in February 1948. 3 years after World War II ended, and a few years before Germany was divided. Nelson grew up in Virginia and went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he met his wife, Sandy, and because the war was going on in Vietnam, decided to join Air Force ROTC as a means to do a service and finish school and pay for it. When he graduated from UNC, just as the war in Vietnam was ending, and he joined the Air Force, his life started becoming part of the twists of fate that happen when you sort of dedicate yourself to national service and, to a degree, trying to change daily and historical events, right? The first turned out that as much as Nelson Drew wanted to be a pilot, his eyesight was terrible. So the first thing the Air Force did was say, you're not going to be a pilot, you're going to be an intelligence officer. And the other twist of fate was that he found out that he liked it. He found out that he actually was intrigued by the idea of a career in the military and a career in the Air Force. Another twist of fate landed Drew at Ramstein Air Base in Germany during the Iranian Revolution, right? And at the time, the U.S. government monitored, and to a degree, the U.S. military monitored activities in the Middle East from Europe, right? Because the Middle East was part of EUCOM and the European Command's area of responsibility, right? This was before Central Command was created. So Drew was sitting in Ramstein Air Force Base during the Iranian Revolution, but there was one problem, which was compared to all his colleagues in the intelligence cell, he didn't speak Farsi. So he had nothing to do. So one of his officers found him something to do and said, why don't you go and look at what's going to happen in the Balkans, what's going to happen in Yugoslavia. And so he ran with the challenge, as he did with just about everything he was given. He eventually became, according to one of his fitness reports, the recognized theater expert. There was nobody in European Command, and there was really nobody in the U.S. government's European operations who knew Yugoslavia as well as Nelson Drew, right? And after Drew left Germany, he continued to write and study Yugoslavia, write about and study Yugoslavia. It became a passion, right? He got intrigued by the sort of odd sort of mix of ethnic and nationalist groups in Yugoslavia at the time, and trying to understand what was going to happen to them if the Cold War ended, or if the central sort of government of Yugoslavia lost the ability to keep everybody together. And so he kept studying Yugoslavia as the Air Force took him around the country. They sent him to the University of Virginia for his doctorate. They sent him to the Air Force Academy, where he became a professor of political science. And each step along the way, even though it wasn't a hot-button topic or a high-profile subject for those who had big aspirations during the Cold War, right? If you wanted to work on big things in the Cold War, you tended to work on Russia or other big countries like China. Yugoslavia was sort of a backwater in many ways. Drew kept studying Yugoslavia, its history, and its delicate balance between its ethnic groups, right? That work paid off when Drew was sent back to the Air Force sent him back to Europe, just as the Cold War was starting to end. He was made a plans officer in a small Defense Department office at NATO headquarters in Brussels. And at the time, at the end of the Cold War, it was actually kind of a really uncertain moment for those who worked in government, those who worked at NATO. It was a moment of uncertainty and a moment of hope and a moment of many questions, right? And Drew later wrote about one poem that was repeated at NATO at the time by the Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, who asked, quote, "Why this sudden bewilderment? Because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come. What is going to happen to us without the barbarians?" Without the Soviet threat, many wondered what the future would hold for NATO, whether the Cold War would be replaced by a prolonged peace, and how long the United States was going to stay in Europe to find out. Now, if the barbarians of the past were gone, Nelson Drew had something to say about the future and at that moment, because barbarianism wasn't far from people's radars, right? Though the long struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union ended far more quietly than many had predicted along the way, that was not true in the Balkans. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, an increasingly torn Yugoslavia, which after all was really just a collection of 6 nations, started to rip apart with reports of atrocities and genocide. And the war in Bosnia slowly became what Drew later called a test case from hell. It was a test for young, ambitious policymakers and military officers like Drew, who had dedicated themselves to learning about Yugoslavia. When your issue becomes the one that's written about on the New York Times, this is a moment for you, right? This is a moment of opportunity for you to explain and use your knowledge, but it's also a test for whether you're capable of helping shape public opinion, shaping policymakers' opinions, and to a degree shaping the events you've been predicting for so long. It was a test for post-Cold War European and NATO leaders who were thinking about how to preserve unity and security on a continent still haunted by past wars. It was a test for the United States, which was at that point a superpower without peer. Right? How was it going to handle the responsibilities of this moment? It was a test for humanity 50 years after the Holocaust, when everybody had said never again, and then here again was a moment of genocide in Europe. And it was a test for a relatively new president, Bill Clinton, who had very little foreign policy experience when he came into government. And it was a test everybody was failing until summer of 1995. A few months before that, Nelson Drew had gotten transferred out of Brussels and brought back home. And in the Air Force's enduring wisdom, they had decided that the recognized theater expert on Yugoslavia should definitely be teaching a class at the National War College in Washington rather than helping the Secretary of Defense make decisions on these things. So Nelson Drew showed up for class in fall of 1994 and wrote a syllabus, and eventually somebody on the chairman's staff realized that Nelson Drew was sitting at Fort McNair, which is in East Washington, right across the river from the Pentagon, and said, "This is the smartest guy we have on Yugoslavia. Let's bring him over to the Joint Staff." So in the middle of the semester, he was reassigned over to the Pentagon and told, "This is your job. You're going to be on the Joint Staff helping us try to make decisions on Yugoslavia." And just a few weeks into that assignment, as the chairman's representative, he went to what is called an interagency policy group meeting, which was basically a meeting on Bosnia that got established really at the end of the Bush administration, Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, and then was continued through the Bill Clinton administration. And these are meetings where basically everybody with what they say in Washington are equities, everybody with responsibilities on Yugoslavia sends a representative to basically try to figure out, share information, figure out what next steps are and make some decisions, or at least make some recommendations up the chain of command to the principals and the deputies and the president himself, right? And so Nelson Drew got sent to a meeting that was smaller than this, but basically just like this. There was probably some water served. Everybody was sitting around a table. And sitting at the head of the table was an NSC staffer, a National Security Council staffer, a gentleman named Sandy Vershbow, who was actually named Alexander Vershbow. And he was a young Foreign Service officer who had had similar twists of fate and had ended up at Brussels at the same time as Nelson Drew. And as a result, when young Nelson Drew walked in, who was a colonel at the time, walked into this meeting, he immediately recognized them both as somebody that knew NATO and knew what he was talking about on Yugoslavia. And so, as another twist of fate, Sandy Vershbow also needed to hire somebody to be on his staff at the National Security Council. And so he took a coaster from out under his water glass, and he wrote a little note, and he said, basically, I'm giving your name as the person I'd like to replace the staffer who's leaving from my team. Now, the way the National Security Council staff works is that it's really a collection of 200 or 300 people, depending on how you do the math. It was a little smaller at this time. But the staff itself, the president gets to appoint a few people to the staff, presidential appointees, people who worked with him on the campaign, things along those lines. But the vast majority of the NSC staffers are actually lent to the staff by the different agencies. So the military lends them military officers for a year or two. The CIA and other intelligence agencies lend them spies and analysts and things along those lines for a year or two. State Department lends them Foreign Service officers like Sandy Vershbow. And generally speaking, the reason that is done is because Congress has never wanted to put a lot of money into paying for the staff itself. So there's very little money for budget. The actual budget of the NSC staff is about $13 million, which for anybody who has ever hired anybody, you know, doesn't go very far towards building a big staff. So all these people are paid for by their different agencies, right? And so Sandy Vershbow had a very small budget, and he knew that the military had already paid for one person to be on staff, so he figured he could get the military to do it again. But he also knew that Nelson Drew was special. So he asked Nelson Drew to do this. And Nelson Drew walked home after he got this coaster, and his wife told me years later that he was in seventh heaven, right? He was a student of government, and he knew what time on the NSC staff had been. He actually had spent a couple months on the NSC staff in 1987, in the summer of 1987, while he was at the Air Force Academy. He got a fellowship to go sit on the staff in the year after Iran-Contra, which was, to be sure, a very weird time to be on the NSC staff. But he had a blast, and so this was his moment. He thought his moment to really shape policy had arrived, right? He also believed that with the right ideas, the United States could meet the test in Bosnia. He really did, at his core, believe that this was a solvable problem, in part because he had been studying it for so long. He thought there was a way forward. This wasn't that the Balkans were just, going to be bloody forever, that these people were inherently violent, or that the United States couldn't shape events like this anymore, right? And he jumped at the chance to work with Verschbau, and he worked deeply and quickly and got up to speed in a hurry to try and give the president an idea. Now, in the summer of 1995, Washington policymaking on Bosnia had really run into a roadblock, right? Productive conversations had sort of stopped. Basically because Bill Clinton wouldn't make a decision. His team on the National Security Council, which is really the collection of cabinet offers that give advice to the president, couldn't agree on anything. The military would be interested in getting involved, and then they would back off. Or the State Department would be passionate about getting involved, and then they would get cold feet. So the council itself couldn't come to an agreement. And so the national security advisor at the time was a gentleman named Tony Lake. And Tony Lake basically said, the big names, the principals, the guys and gals up on the newspapers are failing. I'm failing. You need to take the reins and run with this process because I cannot get this fixed with where I am. I want to solve this problem, but I can't do it. And he said, I will cover you with the president. You guys need to come up with some new ideas. And he basically said, I don't want you to think about all the reasons we can't do this. I don't want you to think about reasons things won't work. I want you to pick what you think is the best end game for Bosnia and then give me a plan working backwards. Right? Which is a very different way than Washington usually makes decisions, which is usually like, all right, we're going to do X, we're going to do A, B, C. He was basically saying, how do you figure out what you want at Z and work your way back, right? And Verschbau and Nelson Drew were ecstatic, right? They basically said that we've been unshackled. This was our opportunity. And they worked with a few colleagues, and they basically came up with what they called the end game plan. And the end game plan was basically complicated matrix of using airstrikes and diplomacy to try and get all the parties to agree to a ceasefire, then all the parties to agree to peace talks, then get all the parties to agree to a map that would basically divide Bosnia up between its parties. Eventually, it was the only idea at the table. The State Department didn't really like it. The Defense Department didn't really like it. The military didn't really like it. But the president said, well, this is my best shot. And one of the interesting, convincing points in it was, this is late July of 1995, you're about to enter a re-election, and this is going to be a flaming mess if you don't solve it during your election year. And so Bill Clinton was partly convinced by the political necessities of the moment. And he said, I'm willing to roll every dice. Let's go with this endgame plan. Now, the biggest piece of it, in addition to NATO airstrikes, was a shuttle diplomatic mission. Right? They were going to send an American team to basically fly between all the parties in Bosnia and convince them slowly that things needed to change. And it was a hard diplomatic job, but it was also one of those diplomatic jobs that everybody knew was going to be high profile. Right? This was a huge presidential initiative to try and end finally the violence in the Balkans. And they needed a special, forceful diplomat to pull it off. They looked at Sandy Verschbau, who was, of course, a diplomat. He had trained as a diplomat and really had been training for this moment his whole life. But he said, this isn't a job for me. I need to be back here at the White House running the whole thing, right? Like, I need to be here managing the process. And so they turned instead to a gentleman named Richard Holbrooke, who is back in the news today. Now, Richard Holbrooke was, even at the time, a legendary Foreign Service officer, had served in Vietnam, had been Assistant Secretary of State in the Carter administration, had a falling out with Tony Lake. He was one of Tony Lake's oldest friends, and they'd had a falling out, which we can talk about in questions and answers. And as a result, he didn't have a job at the Clinton administration, so they sent him to Germany to be ambassador to Germany at the beginning of the Clinton administration, which was a big job. Germany was reunifying. There was a lot of interesting things going on. And even though Richard Holbrooke was passionate about solving the problem in Bosnia, he had written about it, he had advocated for years, he'd basically given up on Bill Clinton. He basically said, Bill Clinton's not getting this done. Now, he had come back to Washington sort of reluctantly after being ambassador to Germany and become an Assistant Secretary of State in 1994 and had struggled to kind of get the Washington process to work or get Bill Clinton to do anything and kind of at that point given up. Now, the challenge with Richard Holbrooke is when he gave up, he also tended to give great quotes to the press. And so, though Richard Holbrooke is back in the news today, thanks to a great biography by George Packer, which is the second best book you can buy on Amazon today, had basically given up on finding a solution to the Balkans, gone on his honeymoon, which is everybody's right. They should go on their honeymoon. But on the way out of town had given the New York Times an interview about Bosnia in which he called Bill Clinton's foreign policy process a gigantic stalemate machine. Now, that was unhelpful in a lot of ways, but it was particularly unhelpful because the New York Times waited to run it until he was named Bill Clinton's envoy for Bosnia. For that reason and many more, the White House wanted one of its own people on Holbrooke's plane. Now, that made some sense, right? This is the way you keep everybody on the same page. It also made sense that Holbrooke needed somebody who knew the policy and had worked on it from the beginning. But it was also about trust, or a lack of it. Now, because Versprall needed to be in Washington, the assignment went to Nelson Drew. And Drew set off from London in early August 1995 with Holbrooke. And Holbrooke actually was pretty pessimistic. He thought it was like a 25% chance it would work. But Drew was much more optimistic. And they set off with sort of what everybody knew and what doesn't always happen, a chance to make history. This was a chance, right? But before they ever got started, tragedy struck. On August 19th, Drew and two other American officials were traveling from a meeting when their armored personnel carrier, which was traveling behind Holbrooke's Humvee, skidded off of the road at Mount Ignum near Sarajevo. The three of them perished on the side of the mountain. Holbrooke, who was one vehicle ahead, survived and went on to push the parties to accept a ceasefire and begin talks at Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, which eventually led to the Dayton Accords, which brought at least a temporary peace to the Balkans. Drew never made it to Dayton. In fact, it was a Saturday in August in Washington, and his wife, Sandy, was at home with her two teenage children at the time, and she heard that there was an accident in Sarajevo, and CNN started reporting that Americans had been killed. And she started frantically calling around the White House looking for somebody to tell her what was going on. But because it was a Saturday, and to a degree because they had this huge policy push, nobody was in the office. Sandy Versprall heard about the accident also on CNN and raced. He had been out of the office. It was the first day off he'd taken in 6 months. Rushed back to the White House and heard news. And he and Tony Lake started driving out to Herndon, Virginia, which is where the Drews lived. And unfortunately, before they got there, CNN reported that Nelson Drew and these two other officials had died. So she learned about the death of her husband from CNN. Now, they went in and comforted her, and to a degree, he was buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 6, and he's one of the few graves dedicated to the Balkans because so few ended up passing on. Now, Nelson Drew is the only NSC staffer ever to die in the line of duty. But like those staffers serving before and after, and those serving today, when given the chance, Nelson Drew chose to sort of say his piece and give his best idea and his attempt to make history. Right? Drew did that and paid the ultimate price for ending a humanitarian tragedy he had foreseen when he was just not that much older than some of the students here today. By simply speaking up, NSC staffers like Drew have changed the course of their own lives and the course of history. In return for their fights, most staffers like Nelson Drew have received the thanks of a grateful president. When Bill Clinton eulogized Nelson Drew at his memorial service, he said the White House and the nation are better for his service. That is certainly true in Nelson Drew's case. But I think the question is whether the country is really better off with this many staffers, with this broad of responsibility, with as much power as has been bestowed upon them in the years, especially since Nelson Drew died, right? After all, not every staffer is Nelson Drew, right? There have been more than a few heroes like him, but there have also been a few heathens, a few saints, and a few sinners, right? That matters not because of the staffers themselves, but because the power they have been given, especially since the September 11th attacks and the wars that have followed. In the years since Nelson Drew's death, unknown staffers like him have gained enough power through their own ambition, new presidential requests, and abdication by cabinet secretaries and departments like the military to manage and deeply micromanage America's relationship with the world and its wars. As a result, today the NSC staff has, somewhat regrettably, become the strategic engine of the government's national security policymaking process. The staff, along with the National Security Advisor, determine which issues, large and small, require attention, develop plans for many of them, and try to manage the day-to-day implementation of their strategies, right? Now, I try to walk a fine line between this because if the NSC staff did not exist, we would need to invent it. because that's why the NSC staff came into existence in 1947, more than 70 years ago. Basically, everybody knew that the world was a dangerous place. The United States had global interest, and it was hard managing national security. And to get everybody to talk and to find a way to make government and national security and militaries and state departments and diplomats and spies talk and work together wasn't the default, right? People tend to do their own thing, and agencies tend to do their own thing. So getting everybody on the same page was important. And the NSC staff has done that very well. Someone needs to bring that regular order to national decision-making, and the NSC staff is as good an option as any. But its growing power has a few ramifications, which I'll just mention briefly. The first is that NSC staffers like Nelson Drew have helped change how America approaches war. That is despite the fact that war is actually pretty hard to manage from the old executive office building, right? Thousands of miles from the front lines and far from harm, the NSC makes recommendations based on what they know. They come to know from intelligence reports, news sources, phone calls, video teleconferences, and visits to the front. In some cases, that has led to good ideas. In some cases, it has led to bad ideas. In some cases, it has led, as I talk about in the book, to one NSC staffer going on patrol in Afghanistan. He threw on an army uniform and took a rifle and went on patrol in Afghanistan. That's not what we expect an NSC staffer to do, but it is something that has happened. And even though it's hard, NSC staffers have still tried to manage wars from the White House, right? And that has some implications for how the United States fights its wars. The NSC staff tends to be pretty impatient about results. They want something to change, and they want some outcome to come fast, right? Which is a good thing, right? We don't want anybody to be exposed and put in harm's way for anything longer. We don't want strategies to be broken, right? But to fix a strategy, the NSC staff often stridently wants to do something more. They very rarely want to do something less. They want to do something more. One NSC staffer said, we should go big when we can go big. And that means real things in war, especially when the military itself doesn't want to go big. The second thing is that the NSC staff has transformed the way Washington works, and often it doesn't work. National security policymaking was never supposed to be a fair fight. The president is the one where the buck stops. He's the head of the chain of command. He's the commander-in-chief. It's supposed to be what one national security and international relations scholar said is an unequal dialogue, one in which the presidents are entitled to not just make the ultimate decision, but to ask questions really whenever they want. The NSC staff has oftentimes filled in for that role and not making the ultimate decision, but asking those hard questions and inserted themselves in the chain of command to do that. Unfortunately, an unfair fight is still a fight. Even before Donald Trump's election, a decade-long bureaucratic battle of attrition had broken out in the nation's capital over the post-9/11 wars. It's really a cycle of tit-for-tat reaction and counter-reaction, where something bad happens in a war, the NSC staff reacts, and sometimes overreacts to try and fix it. They push, they pull, they say this is a crisis, they say we need to fix this, which frustrates those in the agencies and in the military who are sort of charged with fighting the war. And it sort of feeds into this nasty cycle because then the staff gets frustrated, they grow less cooperative, they grow more combative, and which generally leads to an even more forceful intervention from the White House. And so you can sort of see how there's sort of this running cycle of disagreement, overreach, and counterreaction. In the end, what has happened is that as the country has become more polarized, government has become more polarized, and the benefit of the doubt is much rarer. As a result, relationships are burned, the process generally slows down, trust dissolves, and governing becomes much more difficult without a fight. And as I contend in the last few pages of the book, the NSC staff has grown in power and its fights have grown more intense at a very particular and dangerous time in the United States because at the end of the day, the American way of life is in question right now. Americans have lost trust that government works and become increasingly fixated on the belief that a shadowy government of unelected officials secretly manipulate policy to pursue their own interests. This so-called deep state is foreign to American ears for good reason, right? It's a term that was sort of torn from Turkey. But the fear of an unaccountable government is even older than the United States itself. Now, the American people need to know the NSC's war stories, the stories I tell in this book, if for no other reason than it makes clear that there is no organized deep state in Washington. If there was, there would be little need for the NSC staff to fight so hard. This wouldn't be so hard, right? It would be a lot easier to make these decisions. However, this history also makes plain that though the United States can overcome bad decisions and survive military disasters, a belief in a deep state is a threat to the NSC and much, much more. This is a persistent and growing crisis, America's lack of faith in its government, one that appears to be growing far worse. And if we read the news headlines and see where this crisis in Washington is going, will probably get much worse before it gets better. After all, America's faith that elected officials and public servants are dedicated to every citizen's interest is the foundation of not just the National Security Council, but the entire U.S. government. A breakdown in this trust and a persistent, pervasive belief in conspiratorial deep state threatens America's representative democracy. Right? That's a risk not just to the NSC staff, but to all of us. And at a time when Americans are losing trust in government and worrying about deep state, we need to examine how government works and how we can make it work better. The power of the NSC and the growing power of the NSC is just one example of that, but it also leads to questions about what we can do to change what they fight for, how they fight, and whether they fight with you. Fight for you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.